Alright, this is a different video than what I normally do. I've been seeing a lot of inspiring content on YouTube lately, and I thought I'd just take my shot at it. So today I'm going to be reading for 10 minutes to improve my spoken speech. So I got a timer here for 10 minutes, and I'm going to be reading a book today. I made it about halfway through, and I'd like to keep going. Throughout his career, Davidson had almost without exception worked alone. He was used to entering areas of conflict by himself. He preferred the dictates of survival when faced with enthralling danger. He was forced to rely on nothing else but his own keenly tuned instincts. Under those conditions, he consistently produced his best work. Photojournalism has frequently been lambasted for being the product of circumstance. In fact, rarely are any of these images considered in terms of their composition and semantic intent. They are merely news, a happy intersection of event and opportunity. It hardly helps that photographs in general also take only a fraction of a second to acquire. It is incredible how so many people can constantly misread speed to mean ease. This is certainly most common where photography is concerned. However, simply because anyone can buy a camera shutter away and then with a slightly prejudiced eye justify the product does not validate the achievement. Shooting a target with a rifle is accomplished with similar speed, and yet because the results are subjective, no one suggests that marksmanship is easy. In photojournalism, the celerity with which a moment of history is seized testifies to the extraordinary skill required. Even with the help of computerized settings and high-speed films, an enormous amount of technical information must still be accounted for in very little time in order to take a successful shot. A photojournalist is very much like an athlete. Similar to hockey players or bodyboarders, they have learned and practiced over and over again very specific movements. But great photographers must not only commit to reflex those physical demands crucial to handling a camera, they must also refine and internalize aesthetic sensibilities. There is no time to think through what is valuable to a frame and what is not. Their actions must be entirely instinctual, immediate, and the result of years and years of study, hard work, and of course talent. As New York gallery owner Timothy K. Thuan once said, Will Davidson is one of this century's finest photographers, but because his work defines him as a photojournalist, he suffers to this day that most lamentable of critical denunciations. Hey, he just shoots what happens. Anyone can do that if they're there. And so it goes, buy that guy a beer and a sock him in the eye. Only very recently has the detection of a formidable understanding and use of frame balance inherent in all of Davidson's work begun to breach the bias against his profession. Consider for the last time the image that won him the Pulitzer Prize, not even taking into account the courage necessary to travel to Sudan, walk the violent, disease-infested streets, and finally discover this child on some rocky patch of earth, all of which has come consider a major part of photography and even art. Davidson also had to contend with the infinite number of ways he could photograph her: angles, filters, exposure, focus, framing, lighting, etc., etc. He could have also used up a dozen rolls exploring this possibility, but he did not. He shot her once and in only one way. In the photograph, the vulture sits behind Delisle, frame left, slightly out of focus, primary feathers beginning to feel the air as it prepares for flight. Near the center, in crisp focus, squats Delisle, bone dangling in her tawny, almost inhuman fingers, her lips a crawl of insects, her eyes swollen with sand. Illness and hunger are on her, but death is still a few places behind. Perched on a rocky mound, talons fully extended, black eyes focused on famine's daughter. Had Delisle been framed far right with the vulture far left, the photographer as well as the viewer would feel as if they were sitting on a sofa chair, or as Associate UCLA Professor Rudy Snyder speculated, we would be turned into an impartial audience plunked down in front of history's glass-covered proscenium. Instead, Davidson kept the vulture to the left and Delisle toward the middle. thus purposefully leaving the entire right portion of the frame empty. When Ruhala W. Leffler reacquainted himself with Davidson's picture in a recent retrospective, he wistfully commented, It seems people should complain more about this empty space to my knowledge. No one ever has. I think there's a very simple reason too. People understand consciously or unconsciously that it really isn't empty at all. Leffler's point is simply that while Davidson does not physically appear in the frame, he still occupies the right side of the photograph. The emptiness there is merely a mnemonic representation of both his presence and influence, challenging the predator for a helpless prize, epitomized by the flightless wings of a dying child's shoulder blades. Perhaps this is why any observer will feel a slight adrenaline rush when pondering the picture. Though they probably assume subject matter is the key to their reaction, the real cause is the way they balance. The balance of objects within the frame involves the beholder. It instantly makes a participant out of any witness. Though this is still all dark work, at least one aspect of the photograph's composition may have had direct political consequences. Delisle is not exactly in the center, she is closer to Davidson, and hence to the observer by a hair. Many experts attribute this slight imbalance to the large outpouring of national support in the creation of several relief programs, which followed the publication of the photograph. As Susan Sontag sadly mused many years later, her proximity suggested to us that Delisle was still within our reach. See diagram. Opposing morality is a theme which persists throughout Davidson's work. As photo critic M.G. Cafisso maintained back in 1985, Davidson's all-consuming interest in people, and usually people caught in terrible circumstances, always puts him in direct conflict with death. As previously mentioned in chapter 15, Davidson never photographed scenery, but he also never photographed the threat of death without interposing someone else between himself and it. Returning to the ash tree lane meant removing the other. It meant photographing something unlike anything he had ever encountered before, even in previous visits to the house. A place without population, without participants, a place that would threaten no one else's existence but his own. The walls are endlessly bare. Nothing hangs on them. Nothing defines them. They are without texture, even to the keenest eye or most sentient fingertip. They remain unreadable. You will never find a mark there. No trace survives. The walls obliterate everything. They are permanently absolved of all record. Oblique, forever obscure, and unwritten. Behold the perfect pantheon of absence. On the first day of April, Davidson set out on the last exploration of those strange hallways and rooms. The card introduces this sequence as nothing more than exploration number 5. For recording the adventure, Davidson brought with him a 1962 H16 hand crank Bolex 16mm camera along with 16mm, 25mm, 75mm Kern Payard lenses and a Bogen tripod. He also carried a Sony microcassette recorder, Panasonic Hi8, ample batteries, at least a dozen 120-minute metal evaporated DLC tapes, as well as a 35mm Nikon flashes and a USA Bobby Lee camera strap. For film, he packed 3,000 feet of 7,298 16mm Kodak in 100-foot loads, 20 rolls of 35mm, including some 36-frame Konica 3200 speed, plus 10 rolls of assorted black and white film. Unfortunately, the thermal video camera he had arranged to rent fell through in the last minute. For survival gear, Davidson took with him a raided sleeping bag, a one-man tent, rations for 2 weeks, 2 5-gallon containers of water, chemical heat packs, flares, high-intensity as well as regular-intensity light sticks, plenty of neon markers, fishing line, 3 flashlights, one small pumper light, extra batteries, a carbide lamp, matches, toothbrush, stove, change of clothes, an extra sweater, extra socks, toilet paper, a small medical kit, and 1 book, all of which he carefully loaded into a 2-wheel trailer which he secured to an aluminum frame mountain bike. For light, he mounted a lamp on the bike's handlebars powered by a rechargeable battery connected to a small optional rear wheel generator. He also installed an odometer. As we can see, when Davidson first starts down the hallway, he does not head for the spiral staircase. This time he chooses to explore the corridors. Due to the weight of the trailer, he moves very slowly, but as we hear him note on his microcassette recorder, "I'm in no hurry." Frequently, he stops to take stills and shoot a little film. After 2 hours, he has only managed to go 7 miles. He stops for a sip of water. He puts up a neon marker and then, after checking his watches, begins pedaling again. Little does he understand the significance of his offhand remark. It seems to be getting easier. Soon, however, he realizes there is a definite decrease in resistance. After an hour, he no longer needs to pedal. This hallway seems to be on a decline. In fact, all I do now is brake. When he finally stops for the night, the odometer reads an incredible 163 miles. As he sets up camp in a small room, Davidson already knows his trip is over. After going downhill for 8 hours at nearly 20 miles per hour, it will probably take me 6 to 7 days, maybe more, to get back to where I started from. When Davidson wakes up the next morning, he eats a quick breakfast, points the bike home, and begins to what he expects will be an appalling, perhaps impossible effort. However, within a few minutes, he finds he no longer needs to pedal. Once he is heading downhill, assuming he has become disoriented, he turns around and begins pedaling in the opposite direction, which should be uphill, but within 15 seconds, he is again coasting down a slope. Confused, he pulls into a large room and tries to gather his thoughts. It's as if I'm moving along a surface that always tilts downward no matter what direction I face. Resigned to his fate, Davidson climbs back on the bike and soon finds himself crippling along almost 30 miles an hour. For the next 5 days, Davidson covers anywhere from 240 to 300 miles at a time. Though on the 5th day, in what amounts to an absurd 14-hour marathon, Davidson logs 428 miles. Nor does the endless corridor he travels remains the same size. Sometimes the ceiling drops in on him, getting progressively lower and lower until it begins to graze his head, only to shift a few minutes later, rising higher and higher and higher until it disappears altogether. Sometimes the hallway widens until at one point Davidson swears he is moving down some enormous plateau, an infinitely large billiard table or the smooth face with some incredible mountain. He tells us hours later, while preparing a modest meal, "One time I stopped and set out to the right on what I thought would be a traverse. Within seconds, I'm heading downhill again." And then the walls reappear along with the ceiling and numerous doorways. The ship's always accompanied by that inimitable and by now very familiar growl. As the days pass, Davidson becomes more and more aware that he is running precariously low on water and food. Even worse, the sense of inevitable doom this causes him is compounded by the sense of immediate doom he feels whenever he begins riding his bike. "I can't help thinking I'm going to reach an edge to this thing. I'll be going too fast to stop and just fly off into the darkness," which is almost what happens. On the 12th or 13th day, after sleeping for what Davidson estimates must have been well over 18 hours, he again sets off down the hallway. Soon the walls and doorways recede and vanish, then the ceiling lifts until it too is completely out of sight. Direction no longer matters. Davidson stops and lights 4 magnesium flares, which he throws as far as he can to the right and left. Then he bikes down 100 yards and lights 4 more flares. After the 3rd time, he turns around and, relying on the timed exposure, photographs the 12 flares. The first image captures 12 holes of light. In the second images, however, the flares seem much farther away. By the 3rd image, they appear only as streaks, indicating that either Davidson or the flares are moving. However, Davidson's comments on the microstate recorder indicate his camera was firmly fixed on the tripod. Having little choice, Davidson continues on. The hours sweep by. He tries to drink as little water as many thousands of miles he has traveled. He just continues to ride, lost in the trance, born out of motion, describing the ash floor in front of him before it is already behind him. Until all of Davidson, although as if all along during the last week I had sent something out there, Davidson stutters into the possible. The odometer breaks. Davidson does not care. It no longer seems relevant to him how and darkness the lamp on his bike never casting light more than a few yards ahead. Barely nothing appears to have changed. One moment differs from the rest, warning Davidson to stop. High 8 an hour later, and then all at once it was gone, replaced by. Davidson tries to stop, hammering down on the brakes, rubber pads failing to hold, the wheels shrieking, even though he is still seconds before the pale light thrown by the bike lamp will finally catch the side of the end. At that point, I just yanked my bike to the ground, he says, pointing the video camera at his left thigh. My leg's pretty torn up, still bleeding a little. The trailer is completely wrecked. I think that's what finally stopped me. I slid right to the edge. My legs were hanging over, and I could feel it too. I don't know how. There was no wind, no sound, no change in temperature. There was just this terrible emptiness reaching for me. Flush with the brink stands a structure reminiscent of a bartizan. It is no more than 7 feet high and has only one door. Inside, Navidson discovers a winding staircase, which instead of leading up somewhere or down somewhere, lies on its side, penetrating through the wall facing the abyss. Still badly shaken, Navidson does not investigate. Instead, he decides to spend the night, or whatever time of day it is. For some reason, the timestamp on the high 8 is no longer functioning within the confines of that unanticipated shelter. Oh my god. Room cramped, exit out of that, though, through the only pulls himself up the first stair and bike grabs hold the handlebars of the. He then climbs onto pockets cautiously. Sun stuffs into his only book, Navid, and this journey's flashlights, batteries on a step, other items like in the ceiling where it lodged. What the